When the Muslim Arabs arrived in Iberia in 711, the Jews put themselves at their service. A different master, you might think. The Arabs were few in number and sought loyal allies. The Jews have never been too enthusiastic about national service and the military. The two Semitic communities found it in their interests to get along, especially since many Jews were from the Maghreb, the other side of the Mediterranean anyway. And even more of them came to reinforce the presence of the Moors and the Jews of Sepharad. Even Arab geographers point out that Granada, Tarragona and Lucena were Jewish cities to mark the importance of this minority. The development of urban life required merchants and administrators, functions that the Arabs and Berbers were reluctant to perform. Today, the Emirates and Qatar have a very similar outlook. Europe and the continent of India provides the workers that enable the leisurely life of luxury. In the 1100s, Andalusian Roman was supplanted by Arabic as the majority language, and adopting the Muslim way of life as far as name, clothing, food. These are the Mozarabs. This was the fate of the conquered Christians. Bishops translated the Psalms into Arabic, then the Bible, then canon law. Still mostly Roman law. Latin was still the liturgical language of the church. Secular written text was sort of half and half. Arabized Christians were used by the Caliphate for diplomatic missions with regard to the Christian West. Reception, translation of those ambassadors. Exactly the same for the Jews into Christian, Jewish connections and Arab Jewish connections. Vizier to the King of Granada was not a bad title for a Jewish guy. Became warlord for Granada against Seville, after managing the Caliphate's diplomatic relations for a fair while. For everyone, culturally, knowing Arabic gave access to ancient knowledge through Muslim scholars and the immense library that Cordoba had. Cordoba's influence emanated throughout the Iberian Peninsula, including Portugal. 400,000 vellum books in their library. The writings of Muslim scholars included the Indian numbering system that we've all got today. The texts of Aristotle and Plato were there transmitted to the West from Cordoba, and in the 12th century from Toledo and its translations from the Mozarabs. Greek translated from Arabic into Christian cultures. Sephardic Jewish culture flourished in this environment. The secular knowledge was absorbed: philosophy, science, poetry. It was illustrated by a solemn Cathedrale, author of Neoplatonic treatise. Seville, Cordoba, Granada, Toledo and Zaragoza were home to the most flourishing Jewish communities, as was the coast of Portugal, but that was under Celtic influence as well. Maritime was the superhighway of the day. The inlands were almost mountainous and full of superstition, pagan bandits and what you would consider nigh on Stone Age people who had hardly crawled out of their stone dolmens. The numerical importance of minority groups gives them the obligatory tolerance, rather than the elite fooling themselves of their benevolence toward the minority. Averroes who died around the year 1200, is still considered one of the greatest thinkers of Islam from the Al-Andalus period. He came from fairly humble beginnings, born into a family of jurists. In Cordoba he was a Cadi, and a doctor, became a learned commentator on the works of Aristotle, which he made known in all its breadth to Westerners, but died, disgraced, at the hands of the Almohads, having lived at the crossroads of two periods. Much of the transfer of knowledge from the Muslim world to the Latin world took place through the translation of Arabic from the medieval period onwards, notably through the School of Toledo and the Jewish translators of Arabic. Archaeological and historical research on Al-Andalus has shown the importance of the Arab cultural heritage in the development of European civilization. Andalusia during the Golden Age was a period of special growth for poetry, since it seemed to be rooted in the highly mundane concerns of man, in mainly the Jewish man. Love poetry was also taking a prominent place. Perfectly bilingual, Arabic and Hebrew, and assimilated into the Arab-Islamic environment, the Jewish poets of the period, by their impetus and by their brand new form of their poetic creation, raised the following question. At what level does Hebraic love poetry in the Andalusian Golden Age find its roots in Andalusian life itself, and what level do these roots go back beyond this period to the biblical Hebraic text? We're talking about surviving recorded history versus prehistoric. Recorded history is written down from what happens in life, and life has been happening for tens of thousands of years before that. What is written down would be so much different to the confrontations with the Neanderthals and the interbreeding. The First Testament of the Bible is likely to include many of the concerns of Neanderthal people. The Andalusian Golden Age obviously had Arabic love poetry. Why was Hebrew love poetry suddenly in the ascendant in the revival of its origins in Arabic and Jewish culture? For the Jews of the Middle Ages in Spain, Arabic was the key to an entirely new way of thinking. There were two Jews that abandoned the Aramaic for the new language, but Arabic functioned both as the language of high culture and the common tongue of both Jews and Arabs in everyday exchange. It was the same time linguistically akin to Aramaic and Hebrew, with morphological forms and cognates that facilitated transcribing Arabic into Hebrew letters and reading it, the form of Arabic we now call Judeo-Arabic. Assimilating Arabic was even less of a leap for the indigenous Aramaic-speaking Jews of the Middle East than it was for the Jewish immigrants to Europe, making the transition from Aramaic to European vernaculars. Every town and village in Europe spoke a transitional, different vernacular from one end of what is now a country to the other. Not just an accent. The language of the Islamic faith was less repugnant and less threatening to the Jews than the language and the doctrine of the Christian Church. It's estimated the first Jewish communities arrived in Iberia around the year 70 after the destruction of the Second Temple in Jerusalem. They arrived in Portugal in small numbers. Toledo, Segovia and Seville were the largest communities in Iberia. The Jews were more or less tolerated under the Romans and the Visigoths, who set up the Toledo councils. The Jews welcomed the Arab conquerors at the beginning of the 8th century, like brothers or cousins, during the 3 centuries that followed, until the fall of the Taifa kings. Around the time Britain was invaded by William the Conqueror, Jews on the Iberian Peninsula had reached a high economic and social position, such a level that all agree it was the golden age of Judaism in Spain and Iberia, Portugal. To this day, the Iberian Peninsula's most significant contributions to world culture is under the Muslim Al-Andalus period. For the common man, life changed very little over the centuries. Under different regimes or religious dominance, you might get tied to the land or conscripted to the army. Your lot was rather controlled, but all Muslims had a special attachment to the Arabic language and held poetry in high regard. Under the Islamic influence, Jewish culture evolved in new directions. For all in Andalusia, not only was perfect mastery of Arabic a prerequisite for entry into the civil service, but refinement of diction and expression, even to the point of affectation, especially in courtier circles. These skills were the royal road to rapid promotion. This mixed Muslim society showed a passion for eloquence, precious style and decorative details, revelling in esoteric turns of phrases and expressions dating from pre-Islamic period of the Arabic language. Jews, who had long emphasised the verbal rather than the visual, felt a special affinity with Muslims regarding their predilection for language over the image. They realised that perfect command of Arabic was a prerequisite for entry into public office and political advancement. Most of the classical, philosophical and scientific works composed by Sephardic Jewish scholars in Spain, including some of the most deeply rooted texts in Judaism, were written in Arabic. Spanish Jews mainly committed to science and mathematics in Spain, frequently serving as agents for the dissemination of Arabic science through their active role in the translation of scientific works from Arabic into Hebrew. They continued to explore the practical and theoretical sciences until the eve of the expulsion, both in Christian and Muslim Spain. You are, by gaining free education, making a greater education more accessible to all of your people through translation. This was an early spying and industrial espionage of what was given freely, perhaps much the same as Instagram today is given freely and then women's bodies are objectified. You learn your language, you do your work, and then you translate it for your own social group of a hobby of an evening and a weekend. From Umayyad Cordoba onwards, Jewish scientists built astrolabes to calculate latitudes, working especially to improve astronomical tables and navigational instruments during the voyages of exploration to Spain and Portugal. The poet and exegete Abraham Ezra wrote 3 books on arithmetic and number theory, accurately describing the reception of Indian numbers in the Islamic East. Around Barcelona, Abraham Bahaya, a 12th century treatise on practical geometry, was the first Hebrew scientific text to be translated into Latin. It may be the first time that Arabic algebra was mentioned in a Latin publication. Bahia also compiled an important encyclopedia of mathematics. This Islamic geometry and astrology and the associated instruments that were copied enabled who were Islamic and Jewish Iberian navigators to find the New World and establish slowly the transatlantic trade. All the early navigators were of this pedigree. Some may have got their financing from other countries, Italy, and their glories domesticated and their identities changed slightly to suit, but all the famous navigators, name one and they will be from this pedigree. The period of great literary production in Spanish Jewish history ended with the career of Moses Maimonides, who fell victim to the Almohad invasions of Spain and Morocco. Contemporary with the end of this era of symbiosis and relative well-being, he was widely recognised during his lifetime as a jurist, philosopher, community leader. Legal, medical, philosophical writings marked a great legacy, a moment in history of Jewish thought, while Guide for the Perplexed was the subject of much comment and controversy for generations. Lucena, one of the communities of the Jewish diaspora in Al-Andalus, Iberia, contained a great legal recognition in the Middle Ages, precisely that Lucena, a city in the region of Cordoba, which according to Natroni was a place of Israel where many Israelites lived, to the point of calling it Lucena of the Jews, due to the proportionally remarkable presence of Jews. The Jewish exclusiveness of the population of Lucena was proverbial. Contemporary Rabbi Ben Aaron states in his book Provisions for the Way that the whole city was Jewish, and the Arab geographer confirms this. The last memoirs of the Ziri King of Granada, published by Levi or Levi Provençal, tells us how Muslims sometimes sent a military garrison to Lucena, and that there was an official or leader of the Jews put in place, and treasurer, but was also a father-in-law and a grandchild of the leader of the visiting military garrison sent by the Muslims. Even in Lucena there was likely a few contingent Muslims and Mozarabs coexisting, and some that were half and half, a mix of the several different cultural groups, or micro-groups. Lucena became famous for its rabbinical academy, of which we have abundant literary testimonies, created in the image of the famous Jewish academies of Babylon. We do not know exactly how it was configured, but we know its importance thanks to written documents. It was able to enjoy an enormous influence and prestige, judging by the large number of illustrious visitors it received and eminent Jews who lived there. Gayat, of course, Moses Ezra from Granada, more latterly a disciple there first. The Levi family, one of the most prestigious Spanish Hebrew poets of the 11th century. The town of Dudella also gave us a poet in contact with the most important Jewish poets of the time, Abraham Ezra, the first to open up the poetic themes of the Arabs, making appearances in his poems, realistic themes of the daily life, beggars or card players, games of chance and chess. But he also had a liturgical poem with more than 500 poems of the synagogue, whose poetry contains a strong Neoplatonic influence. He was not only a poet, but he also wrote generally brief treatises on grammatical questions, biblical commentaries, mathematics, astronomy, astrology, philosophy, which opened up the doors of the world of Arab culture to European Jews. Samuel Negrella was born in Cordoba, moving to Malaga and Granada and reaching the most elevated positions of the court of Granada with King Badis. Guyat, the great Jewish master and poet from Lucena we've mentioned. Isaac Jacob Fazi from Fez in Morocco. Migash, both rabbi and disciple, who was to flee to Toledo, closing the Rabbinical Academy of Lucena with the coming of the Almohads. Authors of Al-Andalus, at least a dozen more, and a bit of Halakha. Cordoba, the capital, home of Maimonides, the Arab Muslim Caliphate of Iberia. Cordoba was also the largest Andalusian Juderia. The Jewish community lived in harmony with the conquerors who, in order to economise their reduced armies, entrusted the Jews with the administration of Seville and Cordoba. The history of the Jewish community of Cordoba follows that of the Arab occupation and the Almohad and the Almoravid invasions, which limited the freedoms granted to the Jews when they didn't massacre them, causing the community to flee to Granada. Nonetheless, the period from the 10th century to the 12th century was a golden age of Sephardic culture in Spain and Portugal. In the mid-13th century, Ferdinand II took over the city and granted a number of privileges to the Jews, but demanded a tax of 30 gold coins each year. Under the reign of Ferdinand III, violence began and reached a peak with the preaching of 1391, the decade just before the 15th century, and numerous forced conversions are well documented. 1492, a decade before the 16th century, the community complied with the decree of the Catholic kings and emigrated in large part to Portugal and North Africa. The Jewish quarter was situated near the mosque and the episcopal palace. The names of the squares and streets given in the 19th century to the quarter allude to the rich cultural past, the square of Maimonides, Judea Levi, and Tiberius. The Juderia, the old Jewish quarter, extends around the old mosque cathedral. Walls surround the maze of alleys and passages. In the 10th century, the Sephardic Judean community of Cordoba was the largest in the Iberian world. It contributed to the cultural influence and prosperity of the city. The Alley of the Handkerchief is an alley that's 75 centimetres wide at its narrowest point. It leads to the square of the same name, one of the smallest squares in the world, which is very cute, under its tree whose foliage tickles the wall on all sides. Handkerchief Square is an urban format that's copied in a lot of southern and western Iberian towns within the hinterland of Cordoba. One tree central vortake with its lit branches, leaves touching all four sides of a small square with alleyways coming off. This can be found in most old towns in Portugal. Cordoba, now in Spain, has a small 13th century synagogue, a real pearl of Mujadar style. The walls bear inscriptions in Hebrew. Once covered with plaster after the expulsion of the Jews in the 15th century, it was built or rebuilt. Inscriptions on the building tell us. It's the only surviving synagogue in Andalusia, and one of three in Spain. The other two are in Toledo. The synagogue was later used as a hospital, the headquarters of the Guild of Shoemakers, and as a school. In 1884, the Synagogue of Cordoba was declared a historical monument and restored, access through a small patio and a modest door, highlighted by a brick arch. The interior, Mujar style, is a small, square, 6 by 6 metre shape with the decoration based on vegetarian motifs. It is very rich. It's accompanied by inscriptions, especially around the Aron HaKadesh. Finished in 1315, it has extracts from the Book of Psalms, written in red on a blue background. It is, after Toledo, the most spectacular symbol of the Jewish presence in Iberia. The building has been declared a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1994.